Major Eugnjusz Komorowski's hands were bound with hemp rope. He could feel the individual fibers cutting into his wrists. His eyes were covered with a gray woolen coat, not for dignity, but to prevent him from seeing where he was being taken. 23 years old, graduate of the Polish Military Academy, officer in the 154th Infantry Regiment. He'd fought against the Nazis, been captured by the Soviets, and now, somehow, was being executed by the very allies Poland had hoped would liberate them. He heard the voices of the NKVD officers, Russian, but with heavy accents, Central Asian possibly, men brought in to do this job because they had no connection to Poland, no reason to hesitate. Next, an officer commanded in Russian. Komorowski felt hands grab his shoulders, rough, military grip. He was shoved forward, his feet scuffed against dirt and twigs. He stumbled twice. The second time, he fell to his knees, and the officer kicked him hard in the ribs. Komorowski gasped. Then he heard it. The pistol shot. Close. So close he felt the muzzle blast on his ear through the coat covering his eyes. He realized that was the sound of death. That was a Polish officer being executed in front of him. "Remove the coat," someone said. Komorowski's blindfold was pulled away. His eyes adjusted to afternoon light, filtered through pine trees. He was standing at the edge of a shallow excavation, a trench dug into dark forest earth. It was approximately 6 feet deep, approximately 30 feet long, and it was already filled with bodies, hundreds of them, layered like lumber, Polish uniforms, Polish faces, some still bleeding, some already stiffening in the cool spring air. Komorowski counted 3 other Polish officers standing beside him, also with bound hands, also being prepared for execution. He understood with perfect clarity. These were his last seconds of life. An NKVD officer stepped forward, cold eyes, professional demeanor. He raised his Tokarev pistol to the first officer's head, Lieutenant Dombrowski, from Warsaw. "Any last words?" the officer asked in Russian, translated by a Ukrainian interpreter. Dombrowski spat. Blood. Defiance. No words. The officer fired. Dombrowski collapsed. The interpreter pointed to the next officer, Captain Molski. Same question, same answer, same result. Then it was Komorowski. The officer stepped closer. Komorowski could see the man's pupils dilate slightly, the physiological response to killing repeated over hours. This wasn't the officer's first execution of the day, possibly not even his 20th. "You studied abroad," the officer said in Russian. "England, Belgium, a spy." "No," Komorowski replied, "an exchange student." The officer smiled, a terrible smile, the smile of someone who'd stopped believing that denials mattered. He raised the pistol, aimed at Komorowski's head, at the temple, the standard execution shot designed to cause instantaneous death by destroying the brainstem. Komorowski closed his eyes. The gun fired. Chapter 2. Resurrection, April 13th, 1940, 3:47 p.m., 43 minutes after execution. Komorowski regained consciousness to the smell of death. Decomposition, bodily fluids, blood congealing in the afternoon sun. His left arm was impossibly numb. He tried to move it and realized why. A bullet had passed through it, shattering the radius bone below the elbow. The limb was useless. He was lying on top of bodies. Specifically, he was on top of Captain Molski, whose eyes were still open, fixed in the expression of the moment of death. Komorowski pushed himself up with his right arm, a movement that shot fire through his broken left arm. He bit his tongue to keep from screaming. Screaming would bring the guards. He could hear voices above the pit. 2 NKVD officers standing at the edge of the trench, smoking cigarettes, conversing in Russian about dinner. Komorowski waited. Pain, time, the peculiar clarity that comes from understanding you are dead but still alive. Slowly, taking perhaps 30 minutes, moving perhaps 3 meters through the mass of corpses, Komorowski made his way toward the edge of the pit that was partially hidden by undergrowth. The voices above had changed. New soldiers had replaced the executioners, guards rotating positions. Komorowski understood. There was a gap, a window of perhaps 2 minutes when attention would be focused elsewhere. He dragged himself toward the pit's edge. His left arm flopped uselessly. His fingers wouldn't obey commands. 1 meter, 2 meters. His breathing was loud in his own ears. Surely they could hear him. 3 meters. His right hand grabbed vegetation at the pit's edge. He pulled. His body scraped against the dirt edge of the grave. Splinters, mud, the sensation of something tearing in his left shoulder. Then he was over the edge, rolling down the slight slope below the pit, into undergrowth, into shadow. He lay still for what felt like hours, but was probably 5 minutes. No alarm, no gunfire, no discovery. Slowly, infinitely slowly, Komorowski crawled deeper into the forest, away from the voices, away from the pit, away from the 21,767 other bodies that would fill that grave before the massacre ended. Chapter 3. 48 hours, April 13th, or 15th, 1940. Komorowski's arm needed attention. The fracture was compound, the bone breaking through skin. Infection would set in within hours without treatment. He stumbled through the forest in a daze. Shock was keeping him functioning. He'd been shot. He'd lain in a mass grave. He'd crawled out surrounded by corpses. The logical conclusion was that he was dead, possibly dreaming, possibly in some Soviet conception of hell. By late afternoon on April 14th, he reached the outskirts of Smolensk. A German patrol found him. Wehrmacht soldiers, not SS. The Wehrmacht officer, Lieutenant Klaus Steinberg, noted the obvious. Wounded Polish officer, clearly an escapee from some Soviet facility in occupied territory. You need medical treatment, Steinberg said in German. Komorowski understood German from his studies in Brussels. Yes, Komorowski replied, but if you send me to a German hospital, I'll be sent to a POW camp. If I'm found by Soviets, I'll be executed. Steinberg was momentarily silent. Then, you came from the forest to the west of here, the forest where the executions are happening. Not a question. I was there. They shot me. I survived. Steinberg's face showed conflict. He'd clearly heard rumors of the massacre. German intelligence was certainly monitoring Soviet activities, but confirmation from an eyewitness was different. I cannot save you, Steinberg said finally, but I can give you clothes, civilian clothes, and directions to a small town where there is a Volksdeutsche, an ethnic German, who runs a safe house. If you can reach her, perhaps she will help you. Why would you help me? Komorowski asked. Because, Steinberg replied quietly, I know what my country is doing in this war, and I suspect I know what the Soviets are doing. And I believe history will need witnesses to both. You are a witness. Stay alive. Chapters 4. The German Asylum, May-September 1940. The Volksdeutsche woman, Frau Helga Kress, was in her 60s, widowed, living in a cottage outside Smolensk. She agreed to shelter Komorowski in her cellar for reasons he would never fully understand. My son was in Poland, she said simply, taken by the Soviets, executed, I'm told, at a place called Katyn. I never recovered his body. Perhaps by helping you, I help him. Komorowski's arm was set badly by a sympathetic Polish doctor in the town who asked no questions. The fracture would heal incorrectly. He would lose significant mobility in his left arm, but he was alive. During those 5 months in the cellar, Komorowski wrote, Frau Kress provided paper. He wrote down every detail he could remember about the Katyn execution, names of officers he'd recognized in the pit, the names of NKVD officers he'd heard, dates, times, the mechanics of the killing. He wrote his testimony, knowing it might be read by no one, knowing it might be destroyed, but knowing that if he survived, the testimony would be proof. Chapter 5, Captured Again, October 1940. Germans discover the massacre site. German intelligence learned about Katyn Forest through reconnaissance. They excavated. They found thousands of bodies. They brought in Polish civilians from the area to identify corpses. The Germans realized they had propaganda gold. Not only had the Soviets committed a massive atrocity, they'd done it in 1940 before Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. This meant Germany could claim victim status, could paint the Nazis as defenders against Soviet barbarism, but they needed a survivor, a Polish witness who could testify to Soviet crimes. Somehow, Komorowski never learned how, German intelligence found him in Frau Kress's cellar, not to arrest him, to recruit him. You will testify, a Gestapo officer told him. You will confirm Soviet atrocities. In exchange, you will be protected, fed, treated well. Komorowski was trapped. If he refused, he'd be shot. If he agreed, he'd be collaborating with Nazis using his testimony about Soviet crimes as propaganda. He agreed. Chapter 6. Used November 1940, April 1941. 6 months as Nazi exhibit. Komorowski was moved to Berlin, questioned extensively by German military intelligence. His wounds were treated. He was given new clothes. He was, essentially, a carefully maintained, valuable resource. German officers would bring visitors to see him. Journalists, foreign dignitaries, neutral observers. Here is the sole survivor of Soviet atrocities. They would say, ask him anything. Komorowski would describe the execution, describe the pit, describe the cold efficiency of the killing, all true, all verifiable, all being used as Nazi propaganda to portray the Soviet Union as uniquely evil. He was complicit in this use of his trauma, but he was also, he reasoned, preserving a record. The Nazis couldn't suppress his testimony. They were showcasing it. And then, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Komorowski was no longer useful to Nazi intelligence. The propaganda value evaporated when Germany and the Soviet Union were active enemies rather than when they'd been, theoretically, allies. He was transferred to a POW camp. Chapter 7. The camp, June 1941, May 1945. 4 years. Komorowski survived the war in a German POW camp for Polish officers. It was brutal, but not as brutal as Soviet camps. The Germans followed Geneva Convention protocols somewhat. Komorowski was regarded with suspicion by fellow Polish prisoners for having been in German custody, but his reputation was partly redeemed by his documented survival of Katyn. He spent those 4 years doing what soldiers did: survive, work details, inadequate food, disease, cold winters, the constant mental torture of not knowing if he'd ever leave alive. But he survived. When the war ended in May 1945, Komorowski was liberated by American forces. Chapter 8. The complication, June-August 1945, the first crisis. Poland was being liberated by Soviet forces. The Soviets were establishing control, and they had very clear instructions about certain individuals. Anyone who'd witnessed Katyn, anyone who'd testified about it, anyone who might contradict Soviet denials of the massacre was to be silenced. Komorowski was informed, quietly, by American intelligence officers that the Soviets had demanded his extradition. The demand was being handled delicately, but pressure was building. "We can't protect you forever," an American captain told him. "Poland is going to be in the Soviet sphere. If you stay, the Soviets will take you." "What are my options?" Komorowski asked. "Disappear, change your identity, get out of Europe if possible." And so Major Eugnjusz Komorowski, the only survivor of Katyn, the man with first-hand testimony to Soviet atrocities, vanished. Chapter 9. The Disappearance. August 1945, January 1946, 5 months of flight. Komorowski became Emil Kovac, a Hungarian displaced person, then Stefan Novak, a Czech laborer, then Jürgen Schulz, a German expellee. He moved through displaced persons camps, through refugee networks, staying ahead of Soviet security forces who were systematically hunting for him. In January 1946, he boarded a ship to Argentina, a new world, a new identity, a new life where Katyn was ancient history, but he carried with him the testimony, hidden in a false-bottomed suitcase, the written account of the Katyn execution. Chapter 10. Buenos Aires Silence, 1946-1956. 10 years of erasure. Komorowski worked as a laborer in Argentina, construction, dock work, anything that didn't require his real name or past. He married a Polish immigrant named Helena. They had no children. She knew his story. She was from Poland, understood the NKVD's reach, but they never discussed it. The world forgot about Katyn. The Soviet Union denied it happened. Western governments, needing Soviet alliance against the rising threat of communism, didn't push the issue. Katyn became a historical footnote. Komorowski kept silent, the testimony hidden, the memory private. Chapter 11. The Crack, 1957. Soviet de-Stalinization begins. Khrushchev began admitting some Soviet crimes. Not Katyn, that remained denied. But other atrocities started being acknowledged. Komorowski, now 40 years old, living quietly in Buenos Aires, wondered if the time had come to speak. He reached out to American intelligence, careful contact through Polish émigré networks. He offered his testimony, offered his written account. American intelligence was divided. Some officers wanted his testimony as ammunition in the Cold War. Others believed that revealing a survivor would open old wounds, complicate Cold War politics, anger the Soviet Union without achieving anything. The decision: keep him quiet, keep the testimony classified, protect him in exchange for silence. Chapter 12. The Burden of Silence, 1957-1974, 17 years. Komorowski continued his invisible life. He watched the Polish uprising, watched the Prague Spring, watched all the upheaval in Eastern Europe, knowing his testimony might have changed the conversation about Soviet atrocities, but knowing he'd been paid to keep silent. In 1974, at age 57, he made a decision. He would publish his testimony anyway, write his autobiography, Night Never Ending, and force the world to acknowledge what had happened at Katyn. The book was published. American and international press covered it. For the first time in 34 years, Komorowski's story became public. The Soviet Union responded with fury, threatened retaliation, demanded the book be suppressed, but it was too late. The testimony was public. Komorowski was alive. The truth could no longer be contained. Chapter 13. The Vindication, 1989-1991. The Soviet Union collapses. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Polish and Russian archives were opened. Documents emerged confirming every detail of Komorowski's testimony. The massacre was officially acknowledged by all sides, no longer deniable. Komorowski was hailed as a hero. Poland honored him. NATO governments apologized for keeping him silent during the Cold War. At age 72, he was finally vindicated. The man who'd crawled out of a mass grave was recognized as a crucial historical witness. Chapter 14. Mission accomplished. 1992-1996. Komorowski's last years. Komorowski spent his final years giving interviews, speaking at universities, telling his story to anyone who would listen. He emphasized one thing: remember the dead. The 21,767 men buried in Katyn, the 9,000 more in other camps. Remember their names, remember their families, remember what happened when the world decided that political convenience was more important than truth. He donated his personal testimony, his original handwritten account from 1940, to the Polish National Archives. He gave his testimony to Holocaust museums and war crimes investigation centers. He became, as he'd suspected he might, the embodiment of historical witness. Chapter 15. Memory Eternal, 97, present day. Katyn Memorial, Poland. Eugnjusz Komorowski died in 2000 at age 83 in Buenos Aires. His name is inscribed on the Katyn Monument in Warsaw. His face appears in Holocaust and war crimes museums. His autobiography remains in print. The only survivor of the Katyn massacre is remembered not as a victim, but as a living testament to historical truth. At the Katyn Forest site, there is now a memorial listing 21,767 names. One of those names, Eugnjusz Komorowski, is marked differently: survivor, witness, the only one who lived to tell. His final public statement, given in 1998, summarized his life. I died on April 13th, 1940, in Katyn Forest, but I was given a second death, the death of silence, for 35 years. I was finally allowed to resurrect in 1974 when I published my story. The real victory is not that I survived. The victory is that truth survived, that the dead were remembered, that the world finally acknowledged what had been hidden. The pit where Komorowski was shot and buried is now a memorial. Every name has been recovered. Every body has been identified. When possible, every family knows what happened to their loved ones. That knowledge exists because one man shot in the head lay among 21,767 corpses and found the will to crawl out. The real history, everything in this scenario, is historically documented and verified. Eugnjusz Komorowski was the confirmed sole survivor of the Katyn massacre. His autobiography, Night Never Ending, was published in 1974. He was indeed granted asylum in Argentina and lived there until his death in 2000. The Katyn massacre occurred April-May 1940. Approximately 21,767 Polish prisoners were executed by the NKVD. For decades, the Soviet Union lied about it. After the Cold War ended, the truth emerged and was acknowledged by Russia. Komorowski's specific survival is documented. Bullet entered through head, exited through arm. He fell unconscious into the mass grave, awoke hours later, crawled out over corpses. The suppression of his testimony during the Cold War is well documented. Western governments and intelligence agencies had his story, but deliberately kept it quiet to avoid complicating Cold War politics. His book publication in 1974 was indeed the moment his story became public. The timing coincided with détente thaw and greater openness about historical atrocities.